This October, the wrong station celebrates a decade of dread. You can read the show notes to discover terrible new ways to celebrate with us. Today's episode, Iceberg House, is written by Alexander Saxton and performed by Anthony Botelho. He spent 30 years building mansions for the rich in the city's most expensive neighborhood. And after the first couple, he decided that none of these people impressed him much. They were dull, selfish men, people who didn't know how things worked or what they cost, and weren't much interested anyway. Geraldo to his mother, was interested in things. When his boys came home from school and didn't find him on the couch in mesh shorts watching soccer, it would be because he was hunched over a white plastic sheet on the dining room table, rewiring a lamp, or salvaging a small motor for parts, or taking apart an air compressor to see how it worked. The rich men he built for only knew and cared about money, and the more he met, the more he doubted they even knew about that one thing. They just had it. They didn't understand anything about the real world. They didn't know what a Dremel was or a reciprocating saw. They didn't understand the refrigeration cycle that kept their houses warm or cool. They had no idea what lumber cost or, God forbid, labor. They'd wrinkle up their foreheads when they went over a budget. That's a lot for labor, they'd say, every single time. Because they understood that nails cost a set amount, but you could browbeat the cost of labor down. It took a few years for him to learn how to browbeat back. He'd fold up his big forearms and hunch his shoulders. Well, he'd say, we have to actually build the house, you know. He did this for 30 years. Lost a lot of work because of his surly attitude. But he never cared, because he did good work, because he cared about good work. And so anybody who was building a house to live in, not just sell, would always hire him. But by the end of 30 years, he was sick of it, and sick of the guys in the white shirts and chinos with their oblivious questions. Why can't we just put the heat pump here? Are you sure you can't help us out on labor? He was tired of driving past the mansions that he built, on his way back home to the old yellow brick bungalow where he and his family lived. These men weren't better than him. By any objective measure, they were worse. It wasn't right that they should live in better houses than his family. So he decided he would build a mansion of his own. It took 12 years. He tore down the bungalow and moved his family into an apartment building 15 minutes north. He got a building loan and a zoning exception and made deals with the neighbors who had no idea the scale of what he was planning. He dug down through the entire footprint of the property to a depth that made you dizzy if you stood the fenced-off edge and looked down. Gray waters gathered far below. Monumental girders spanned the depths, their steel rusting slowly as they strained to keep the houses on either side from collapsing into the pit. For years, that hole sat empty as the socket of a pulled-out tooth. The neighbors grumbled, but they didn't sue. Then, one summer, a spiderwork of steel suddenly arched up out of the ground, and before anybody could believe it, concrete thickened on the metal bones until a house suddenly existed, staring empty out of the street with its wide, dark eyes, hunching its huge shoulders over the eaves of its neighbors, crowned with the black slate shingle of a buried church. The yellow bungalow had had lawns out front and back. Now there was no back, only a thin cement strip for a heat pump condenser and some garbage cans. And there was no grass, only an expanse of blue glass gazing down into the cool depths of the pool below. That summer, Gerald's sons helped finish the interiors, and went back to school with Autumn. His older son had kept getting injured and declared the project cursed. Gerald didn't mind. He was used to working on his own, even when the cavernous spaces filled up with autumn twilight. The acoustics were good, and so it was easy to dismiss any small noises in the dark as far-off echoes of his own work. Then, at last, the house was ready. On move-in day, Gerald, his wife, and younger son all stood outside as the great, dark eyes of the house looked down. It took them a long time to bring their suitcases up the front steps. For that first week or so, they were awed by all the space. They would wander through, slack-jawed, like French peasants at Versailles. They couldn't believe they lived there. It felt unreal, like squatting in a giant's mansion. At first, the space was intoxicating. They'd been living on top of each other all their lives. Now, space felt like freedom. But soon, they began to miss the closeness and clutter and warmth of their old lives. They gravitated toward a small set of rooms on the second story, and when they were out in the vastness and silence of the rest of the house, they began to feel uneasy. There was a wine cellar, but none of them drank much. There was a swimming pool, but they rarely swam. They had a regulation basketball court, but none of them played, and the space quickly began to fill with boxes. They had a home gym stocked with equipment for the resale value, but none of them worked out. They had a 6-car garage with an elevator, all for just one family vehicle. And so the great house sat mostly empty. After dinner, they retreated from its oncoming darkness into the still-too-big spaces of their private rooms. And the huge darkness of the house was left to its own thoughts and devices. Gerald still liked to tinker, and he spent a pleasant few weeks finishing rooms in the basement, laying down linoleum or carpet, wiring new lighting fixtures, whistling tunelessly to himself as he installed a 7th bathroom. But there was always another room to do, and as the new year opened gray, it all started to seem pointless. Gerald's family was never going to use the space, and if they sold the house, it would be to the kind of person Gerald hated anyway. So, why bother doing the work? Soon, the white plastic sheets lay empty. He spent his days in mesh shorts in front of the television. Whole stretches of the 3rd and 4th basement lay unfinished as the winter turned to spring. Then, baking summer. He thought about going back to work, but he couldn't stand the thought of building another house for another white-shirt prick. He thought about consulting or investing, but that came down to working with the exact same people. So he stayed retired and rattled around the big empty house alone all day. He should just sell the place, Gerald's eldest son told his parents. But the market was slow, and though they could sell the house for more money than most families would see in a lifetime, it still didn't seem like enough to justify all the effort and investment that had gone into building. So they stayed, and everyone who lived within took up the hobby of collecting one thing or another, books, furniture, appliances, or second-hand clothes, in a vain attempt to fill the emptiness around them. Whole rooms filled with unused things. But there were always more rooms to fill. At night, those noises you heard, well, they were just the pumps. 7 of them, running continuously in a half-story 24 feet underground, for as long as the house should live. If the pumps went out, the groundwater would seep back in. At night, those pumps would click or creak or groan or laugh or moan to themselves in the muffled silence of the half-height floor. The conversation echoed strangely through the limestone kitchen and broad front hall. Gerald's wife developed a recurring nightmare where a man was loose inside the house, running and dancing and spinning in the great empty spaces as if they belonged to him. Gerald had a dream of his own, where he hosted an open house, and all the rich men whose homes he'd built came to look enviously at the place where he lived. He dreamed that when they came inside, it was just the little bungalow where they'd lived before. But he was ashamed. It was bigger than this, he kept telling them, as they looked around with polite and patronizing expressions. "I swear it was bigger than this. It's quite impressive," one of them would say, with his boardroom smile, in its own unassuming way. If Gerald's son was having dreams, he never told them. They never saw him these days. 1 year and a day after they first moved in, a pump went down. And though Gerald had once been the kind of person who'd have been excited to spend an afternoon repairing it, now it seemed like too much of a chore to go all the way down to the dim lower levels, too much of a chore to spend more time working on a house. There were 6 other pumps after all, and then 5 the next year, and then 4. He knew better than this, of course. Each pump that went down put more strain on all the others. But each year he let another one run down. He was like one of his own oblivious customers, and the black water, which had been forced out into his neighbor's basement to soak the ink from their old family photos, began to seep back in. And then, on an October morning, 7 autumns and 7 days after they'd first moved in, the house was fully silent. No pump still murmured in the darkness. It had been a long time since he'd seen either of his sons. He realized it had also been a long time since he'd seen his wife. When he went out looking for them, he couldn't find anybody. The upper floors were abandoned, and so were the leaf-strewn balconies, and the huge kitchen, and the savannah of the living room. "Dina?" But his voice echoed through the house without an answer. He called his wife's phone, but she didn't pick up. He texted her and waited for an hour, but she didn't text back. "Dina?" He climbed down to the blue humidity of the pool room, but the water was empty and flat, and no clothes lay neatly folded by the pool. He went down deeper, further from the sun, through cellar and garage and gym and the floor of just old stuff, and the silent half-story of the pump rooms. Nobody there. Or there. Or there. He tried to call his sons, but was too far underground for signal now. He went deeper. When he flicked on the lights of the floor that was supposed to be a basketball court, they chunked alight in batches, revealing with their hard white glow the black water which had flooded up to buoy all the old boxes and appliances and who knows what else they had stored down here along the years. He covered his nose and almost gagged, because the smell of the water was rotten and fetid and gleeful. He was worried now, well and truly worried. The bulbs above flickered. They hadn't been changed in many years. "Dina?" He waded out into the water, half afraid he'd find her floating face down in the sludge. The light bulb blew, and everything went dim as he arrived at the far shore of the flooded court. "Dina!" He wiped sludge off his feet with the lid of an old cardboard box. There were more rooms beyond, empty spaces of undefined purpose, which had never been used for anything. He went through them, calling, using the flashlight on his cell phone, and then found the stairs down to the next level, a half-flooded sub-basement of unfinished concrete walls and pillars. He waded through that one, too, and then down the next flight of stairs into the second garage, which was empty and miraculously dry, flooded only by the hard white light of fluorescent bulbs. He stopped, overcome by an intrusive thought. Because he felt so alone, he spoke it aloud. "God, did I really build all this?" The question fell flat in silence, and he wandered between the empty concrete columns. Why'd he needed all this? Then he found the next flight down, and wandered through a second boiler room, and began to wonder if he'd strayed into someone else's home somehow, because he didn't remember putting in a second boiler. "Dina?" And, for that matter, had there ever even been a second garage? No, something was wrong. There had been some breakthrough into one of his neighbors' homes, because there had never been a second garage, or a sub-basement underneath the court, or a painting studio, or a workshop, or a nursery? Who would build a nursery so far below ground? Or a printing room, or an office full of unassembled cubicles, or a basement kitchenette, or a long-tiled room with a long, shallow pool in the floor? Dina? But the work was all his. Wasn't it? He crept down the stairwell. He knew the manufacture of the railing. The well was unfinished and industrial. How many flights of stairs like it had he built, leading down to the back of house of rich men's homes? It had to be his work. Everything was done right, up to his own exacting standards. And as he climbed down, he had vague memories of installing this light and polishing this terrazzo floor. Didn't he? And the house just went down, deeper than any of the mansions he'd built for bankers and lawyers and executives. It was all his. Suddenly, pride flared up inside him, an excitement, and he began to take the downward steps 2 at a time. He longed to see what wondrous places, what palaces he'd built himself below. White fluorescence flickered as his downward footsteps echoed up. The stairs bent back and back and back again. They led a long way down. The Wrong Station is made possible with the generous support of our listeners on Patreon. Join us today at patreon.com/The Wrong Station for bonus episodes, behind-the-scenes content, ad-free listening, and additional goodies celebrating our decade of dread. The Wrong Station is co-produced by Alexander Saxton, Anthony Botelho, and Jacob Duarte Spiel, with music composed and performed by Alon Citrin, and arranged for the viola and performed by Viola Schmidt. You can follow us on social media at The Wrong Station, or email us at thewrongstation@gmail.com. And until next time, thank you for listening.